All right, hello. In this video, we're going to be talking about DOM manipulation, which is sort of the fundamental way that we're going to be able to use JavaScript to make web pages interactive. So this is how we use JavaScript to actually change the content that's on a web page. So what is the DOM? So the DOM is an acronym. It stands for Document Object Model. And so this is a model, this is sort of a structure, and it's a way of representing the information that in HTML. So the model, right, the way that we think about sort of content in HTML is as a tree of elements, right? We have a bunch of elements and they each have children inside of them, that have children inside of them, and so forth. It creates this tree data structure. So that modeling, right, okay, information is going to be structured as a tree is the DOM. Now, the document object model, the way this gets structured, also provides a set of functions, a set of methods that let us be able to access and manipulate that tree. So it's a data structure, and then there are methods upon that data structure. So we can access and use in JavaScript. So we're going to write JavaScript to manipulate this tree. So when people think about the DOM, we actually are thinking about the HTML itself, like not the source code HTML, but the HTML as rendered in the document. When you open up the developer tools and you see that the elements, that's the DOM. So we refer to that as the DOM. All right, so we can manipulate this, as I said, with JavaScript. So the first thing we're going to do in order to manipulate particular elements in a tree using JavaScript is we have to have a way of referring to those particular elements. I have to say, I want to manipulate the header. I want to manipulate this paragraph. I want to change them. I have to have some way of talking about that header, that image, that paragraph. So the way that we're going to do that is by using a function that's built into the browser called document.querySelector. So this is going to be part of the document global, which represents the entire HTML document that's, again, provided by the browser. And it has a method in it, kind of like console.logs method. It has a query selector function that we can use to select elements, to refer to a particular element using a CSS query. So the way that we would write this is we're going to call our function document.querySelector, and Visual Studio is really bad about like auto-completing things, so just bear with me. This is a function. The argument to this function is going to be a string. So we're going to write quotes, and inside that string is going to be any CSS selector that we would use to refer to or select an element. So if I want to talk about an H1 element, I would put an H1 in as that string, right? I'm not just putting the H1 directly. I need to put it as a string because we're in JavaScript. So that lets me select the H1 element on my page. This function then returns a variable, a reference to that element. So it returns effectively the element as a value. So I can say this thing is going to be the H1 element. I can then console log it to see what it looks like. And that's our code. So in my HTML here, right, my H1 element is an H1 that has the word DOM manipulation demo. Here's my demo we've got. I've got a little puppy picture we'll play around with in a moment. So if I refresh this page, it runs the script. You'll notice that from that line, that console log, I'm logging out the H1, the DOM manipulation demo, right? That's the element, the H1 element. Now, to be clear, this is not a string. It's not the text bracket H1 bracket DOM manipulation demo bracket slash H1 bracket. It's not that string. It's an actual DOM element. Like the data type is HTML element. But we need to be very careful, and we're writing this code, and it can get confusing if we're distinguished between elements, variables of type HTML elements, variables of type strings that are CSS selectors, and then sort of a string that is the HTML content itself. Cool. So this lets me select that element. Again, I can refer to anything I want in here. So I can, for example, refer to the image element. I'm naming these elements so it's clear that's what we're talking about. It's going to be the image, right? If I console log out my image element, then again, it's logging out my image. Because this is a CSS selector, I can use anything I want. Any kinds of selectors that we would use in CSS, you can put inside this string. So if I want to select a particular section, like maybe I want to select the puppy section, right? The ID, that element, I can select it by its ID. I could say I want to select the puppy section. Oh, here. I'm just gonna make this a general element so I can change it really quickly. So I can select the puppy section, right? Again, I'm selecting it by ID using the ID selector. We'll get to that in a second. if I console.log element here, right, that logs out that selects the section element, including all of its content inside of it. I can select the section element and then select the H2 that is inside the puppy selection. So again, I'm using my descendant selector, my space, inside this string, right? So the contents of the string are the selector itself, which can include lots of different pieces. So we can say select me the H2 inside the puppy section. Save you, refresh you. That then gives me the a puppy H2 as opposed to some of my other sections where I've got some songs, forms, and stuff. So we can use any CSS selector we want, including element types, class types, descendant selectors, compound selectors. You can use any kind of structure you want in order to be able to select a particular element and get a reference of that element on the page. Query selector is the correct tool to use in pretty much all cases whenever you're trying to select an element. If you want to select lots of elements on the page, there is a query selector all function that will then return what's in effect an array of elements. So I could say select all anchor elements within the nav, right? So again, we're using our descendant selector here, and this will give me an array of all the anchor elements that are inside of that nav. If I just used query selector singular, it would just get me the first anchor element inside the nav, even if there happen to be more of them along the way. Those are the that's the sort of the functions you'll want to use for selecting things. JavaScript does include other selecting functions. Get element by ID is the one you'll see most often. In practice, when you're working with a DOM, it's best to just use query selector. It is more powerful because you can use any kind of CSS selector. It's easier to manipulate and to change and sort of produces better style along the way. So query selector is the function we want to use in order to gain a reference to a particular element. Okay, great. So I'm going to add we'll be good. So now that we have the reference these elements, we can then begin manipulating them. And so there's lots of different ways. Now that we have this variable, this object that's a DOM element, we can manipulate it. We can change it. We do that by assigning new values to its properties. So we actually change its values, its properties. And we can do it by calling functions or methods on that element. And depending on what we want to change will depend on how we want to do stuff. So, for example, if I want to, I'm going to just be changing elements. If I want to take my H1 element that I've already selected previously, and I want to change its content, I can manipulate its text content attribute. And what I can do is I can assign a different value to its text content, to the actual text inside that element, in order to change it. This is changed content. Now what'll happen here, right? There's my H1. Remember, there's my H1s right there. If I hit refresh on my page, you'll notice that it now says this is changed content, right? I've now changed the content through my JavaScript. Now, to be clear, I haven't changed the source code. My HTML source code still is DOM manipulation demo. I haven't modified that file at all. What's happening is that when the JavaScript code is executed, that code is going into the rendered DOM, right? The DOM that's actually being shown and included as part of this picture, I'm sorry, this element, and as part of this page, and it's changing that thing's content, right? It's changing the content inside of this header. Cool. Great. Yes, that's what we're doing. The other thing we need to make sure to note, and if you watch this carefully, I'm not sure how well it's going to show up in the video, but watch this carefully. If I hit refresh, watch this right here. You see how it flickers, how it kind of jumps a little bit? That's because what's happening here is that my browser is rendering the HTML initially, right? When the browser says I need to load the page, it's going through and it's showing the body and the header and the H1, and it shows the H1 with the words DOM manipulation demo. Then after it finishes rendering all this content, it gets down to my form, or not to my form, to my script, and my script says, now change that previous content. So the browser actually will render the old original version of the content, right, of the H1, and then re-render, right, sort of manipulate it to make it turn into the new version really, really quickly. But depending on how fast your computer, your browser is, and depending on how much stuff there has to happen, it can create this kind of flickering effect where it sees sort of the old content and then the new content. This generally isn't a problem when we're actually making pages interactive. We're not going to be manipulating them at page load time. We're going to be doing it a different way. There's other ways to get around this, but just sort of keep in mind that what you have in your HTML content and what you have in your JavaScript are going to be manipulating each other. Well, the JavaScript will be manipulating the HTML, the HTML will the JavaScript. Okay, great. So we can manipulate its content. We can manipulate its attributes of elements. So for example, I can take the image here, right? I've got my image element, and I can change its source attribute. Remember, my image has a source to this puppy, and I can change that to be a different value. And again, I'm assigning a string because that's what the source is. It's a string. And so this can be to, I have another image in here. I have a husky.jpg file. Okay. And now when I reload my page, it loads a different picture, right? It assigns a different source to that image. And of course, because I've now changed the source, I should make sure to change the alt attribute as well. A grown ski. So we can manipulate and modify the attributes of particular elements. We can do this for any built-in attribute. And again, you just access them like properties. So you just talk about image elements source, image elements alt, image elements ID, image elements whatever. The one attribute we don't use this for is for class. If I'm trying to access and manipulate a particular class, I'm going to do that by using methods that I'm going to call on a property called class list. So I don't want to manipulate an element's class as a string, right? I don't want to say, look at this element at, for example, at my header here, and I don't want to think of this as a single string. Instead, we're going to think of it, that class, as an array, as a list of different classes, right? So this header has 3 classes at the moment: BG primary, text white, and padding 2, P2. So if we go ahead and we select my header, so remember, if we want to refer to it, we have to go ahead and use document.querySelector in order to select the header. We can then manipulate its classes, like what CSS classes it had, by referring to its class list property. So we go to the header element and to the class list property. And then we can call functions on that, namely add or remove, to add or remove classes. So if, for example, we try to add padding 5, let's add a ton of padding to this thing. Right? When I refresh my page, suddenly it now has the padding 5 class because I've added that in. If we look at the actual DOM, and whenever you want to know like what effect happened, the way to check this is in the browser. Go look at that elements tab and say, what DOM did I get? What effect did my JavaScript have? And you'll notice what it did is it added the P5 class to my class list here. Now I already had P2, but Bootstrap of course overrides it because of P5 during the P2, so we end up getting both. Similarly, I could remove the background primary class in order to make it so that my background is now white and my text is white too. So the text is there, you just can't see it because I removed the class. So what this tends to mean is that if we want to, let's add a, I don't know, what do we want to add to this? How about let's add padding on the start file. We're just gonna add a bunch of like beginning padding there. So we'll just move it over to that side just to show that it works. Not bothering us too much. So the way here is if we want to style, if we want to manipulate what a content looks like, is we can just go to that element and manipulate its class list. It is also possible to assign specific CSS properties to an attribute, to an element. You can do this by accessing the style property and then assigning literally what property you want it to have, the font size, the boldness, the whatever, any property you would assign in CSS, flexboxing, whatever you want to do with it. We very rarely want to use this. It's considered bad practice to use sort of direct inline styling like this. If you want to change the appearance or the style of an element, give it a class, add or remove some modular class to be able to structure and style it the way you want. Okay. So that's going to let us be able to then manipulate existing elements that are already on the page. And we can change really any things about values about them we want. The other thing that we're going to be able to then do in using the sort of this DOM API is we can be able to create and add additional elements into our page. We can remove them as well. It's a little bit less common. Mostly we're thinking about adding, we often think about being additive when we're thinking about constructing client-side applications. So we can create new elements by using another method that is provided by the DOM in this document class called document.createElement. So here's going to be new elements. So what we're going to do is we can call document.createElement create element. And then this function is going to take in a string as an argument. So we're going to pass it in a string. And what that string is going to be the tag of the new element type we want to create. So for example, if I want to create a new paragraph, I would just put in a P. I don't put the angle brackets around it. I'm not actually writing out the tag itself. I'm just saying, which kind of tag do I want to create? Do I want to create an image or a paragraph or a list item or what? Actually, we'll create a list item. We'll add a new, I've got my list of top 5 songs here. We'll add a list of a new song to a new Beatles song here, or a new song here, or whatever. All right, so this is going to be to create a new list item. This function then returns that new element, right? Returns that new element object, a reference to that object. Great. This li element, right? If I console log what this thing looks like, new li, I go to my console. Right? It's an li element with no content, right? Because I haven't actually said what's inside of it. I just said, make me a new li element. So if I want to change its content or its styling or anything about it, I have to use additional lines of code, additional domination methods in order to do that. So I can say, let's take my new li and let's give it some text content. And we're going to have this be the Beatles, Hard Day's Night. Right, which is the name of the song we're going to add to our list, I guess. So now again, now that I've created my new li and I set its text content, when I refresh my page, you'll notice that now it says that this is an li. This is a behavior we get occasionally. Lost it. So you'll notice that when I refresh that, it's sort of because something that Chrome's developer console did, and I'm not totally sure exactly what's causing this, is it doesn't render them as like nice HTML elements. Instead, it renders them as objects and like with particular types with them properties, and you can expand them out to see all the different properties inside there, or just refresh the page, and usually it'll clean itself up after a moment. Great. So now I have an li element that has the Beatles, the Hard Day's Night, which is what I want to add. Cool. You'll notice, though, that as I'm refreshing my page, while it's logging out this new li element, it hasn't added it into my list yet. Just because while we're able to create a new element using document.createElement, we have to actually specify where do we want to put that into the DOM tree. I can't just say put on page, because the computer is going to ask, where? Where do you want to add this new element? So when we create an element, we've created this sort of element, but it's sort of floating off on its own. It's not actually part of the DOM tree yet. It's not actually part of the page. The way that we create and add an element to a page is we're going to use another function called append child. So we're going to find the parent, right? Who do we want this element to be inside of? And then we use the append child method to add that element as a child of its parent. So because we want this element to be inside of my top 5 song list, we can select that song list. Document.querySelector, right? We got to use selector to select the song list. Let's see. This is an ordered list, but there might be lots of ordered lists here. So I'm actually going to be a little bit more specific and say it's the ordered list inside of my data section. So again, I'm going to use my ID selector. This will be my data section, and then the OL that's inside of it by using my descendant selector. This is good practice, right? This is actually where we start using ID selectors in JavaScript, because now I need to very specifically refer to a particular element on the page. Not that I want to style one part, I want to like really refer to one thing because I'm now working with the DOM and the manipulation itself. All right, so there's my song list. I can then append a child to that element. There's an append function. Append child is the one we want to use. And I can append my new li to that element. Refresh my page. Ta-da! Now I have another li into my page. If I look at my DOM here, my data section, my ordered list now has 6 LIs, one of which is my new Beatles Hard Day's Night. So this will let us be able to create new elements and add them to the page. Okay. In practice, like this gets complex, right? This was a lot of code. I mean, this is a very simple element, but you can imagine as we want to create more and more complex elements, there might be lots and lots of lines of code that we need to make that happen. So a good practice, and really a best practice, is to create what I refer to as render functions. So these are functions that are named either render something or create something, that basically their job is to take in some data and then produce the DOM elements that are going to be reflecting that data. They're going to say take in some information and then produce the DOM element out of it. So you can imagine we can go ahead and create a new function here called maybe create song link or song item that can maybe take in a title or how about an artist and a title, right? Because that's my data that I'm going to take in. I want to be able to have my artist and title. I want to be able to create the song item. And then inside this function, I can go ahead and do my work. I can say, let's create my new LI. I'm just copying the code that I had previously. Let's take my new LI and let's set its text content to be okay. I have the artist plus a dash plus the title, right? That's what it looks like. And then my function can return this list item. So I'm now going to say my function's job is basically to say take some data and make the list item out of it. Not necessarily what to do with that list item yet, but just to create the thing along the way. And of course, now what I have to do that is instead of me doing sort of my old work that I had up here, I'll move this guy down. Right now, what I can do is I can now say, here's my new song item. Could be the result of calling create song item and passing in the Beatles and Hard Day's Night 2, just make sure it's clear it's happening. Then I can go to my song list and I can append my song item. And again, my song item was created by this function. So there, now it's doing the exact same effect, but I've now created a function to do that work so that if I want to add lots and lots of songs, I can just call this function lots of times without having to keep calling document.create element over and over and over and over again. I can just write that code once instead of having it all come together. And of course, this then will let me then begin working with more complex sets of data. So up at the top here, I actually have an array of song objects, each of which has an artist and a title, as well as a link to be able to do some stuff. So what we can then, of course, imagine doing is I can imagine saying that's an array of songs. Let's loop through it. I can say for const song object in song array. Right, so we're going to So we're going to do a simple for loop. We're going to loop through that array of content. And then for each of those contents, I can then say, make me a new song item. We're not going to be able to do it down here. That called create song item, which will be then the song object's title, no, song object's artist, and the song object's title. So that's going to make me a song item for every one of these things. And then for every one of these guys, I can append them to my song list. Right. So again, what we've done now, we've been able to do it inside of a loop. And we've sort of, because we have a function that does that work, it becomes a lot easier for us to manage this. Right. So, did not work. What's the problem here? Reference error song item is not defined. Did you not work? Oh, this one. That's the one. Line 43 is the one broken. There we go. Cool. And then we're able to add each song from my list, right? Queen's Don't Stop Me Now, David Bowie Starman, Taylor Swift's Cruel Summers. Great. So we can then be able to create these sets of elements and we'll put this together. Of course, the other advantage of then this function is that it means that we can then, if we want to change what that data looks like, we want to make it look more complex, we can actually do that without having to rewrite that code over and over and over again. I can just do it inside of this one function. So in order to simplify this a little bit, I'm going to convert this. And so this actually takes in the entire song object itself. And then we're going to access that song object's artist and that song object's title right here. So instead of passing in the two individual strings, I'm just going to pass in the whole damn object. And I'll continue to work. Now, if we decide we want to, for example, make these list items into links, I want to be able to click on them, then we can do that work. We can modify my create song item. So instead of returning just an LI, it can return an LI that contains a link inside of it, which is fine. We can do that. So let's start by creating the link. So this is going to be the anchor element. Document. Nope, that was the wrong one. Document dot create element, make a new anchor element. I can make the anchor elements text content to be the string, right? So again, my title and string is going to be inside the string. I can make his href value be the song object's URL. What do we call it? It's a YouTube URL. Is that what I called it? YouTube URL. Okay. Then, now that I have that song on that anchor element, I can create my new li element, and then I can take my new li and give it a new child that is this anchor element. Right. So I mean, the order doesn't quite matter here, but I've made the anchor and then made the li to add it to that. I could have made the li and then made the anchor to add to it. It doesn't really matter. And that returns that. So now my loop here, my function, goes through all my song arrays and creates that song item out of each object and then appends that object, whatever it may be. So this lets me convert from by changing this single function, this create song item, I'm able to make it so that now we have a list of links instead of a list of just text. Similarly, you could imagine that if I decide I don't want my page to be links, to be list items, I want them to be cards inside of a div, I can manipulate just this function while leaving this code and this function kind of all the same. So this tends to be kind of the best structure to think about when you're building out sort of DOM content, right? We're going to create these functions that are going to create elements, returning them. Render functions are ones that usually will include appending onto the screen, will actually put it where it needs to go. And then I can then be able to do that work. We can nest these things together. So I could, for example, have a function that creates a link element and then one that creates the list itself, right? That has the for loop inside of it. And then I could just say, make me the whole list, the whole unordered list of content, and attach that to my nav. So we can sort of build this out in structures the way we go, where each function is now creating these objects for us to work with. It's a little bit kind of an object-oriented style approach, but we're not actually making classes. We're just defining functions that then create the objects we want. A little bit like constructors, but not totally the same. Great. The one other thing that you'll notice here is that while I was appending these things to my songs, my old Beatles songs are still there, and those still require hyperlinks. If I don't want to show this content, I don't want these elements to be here, I would want to remove them. I want to get rid of them. There is a remove function in document. There's a document.remove, but it's a little bit awkward to use because you have to actually find the element, and that becomes tedious and hard and annoying with a string. What tends to be a better practice is that if I want to sort of add new stuff to my list of songs, what we'll often end up doing is taking my song list and setting its inner HTML. So setting the HTML inside of it to be an empty string. So what this is going to do is it's going to empty out the element. It's going to basically take the contents of that OL and it's going to delete all those contents. It's going to make it so it's just an OL with no kids inside of it. That deletes everything that used to be there, and then I can have my content, my loop that goes through and says, now add the content I actually do want to be there. So that now I get my list of songs, my top 5 songs that are only the data set, the data from my array. And of course, if I want to add more stuff to my array, right? So if I want to add another element, so this could be artist, could be the Beatles again. Beatles are great. Gotta have Beatles. This could be Hard Day's Night. I'm going to skip the YouTube link URL for now, right? By adding a new element to my array, it immediately adds a new element to my list when I refresh the page. Because again, my code is just saying, take the data and put that data, use a loop to put that data on the screen. I know it looks like a hyperlink. That hyperlink, you notice, just goes to undefined, doesn't go anywhere. So this is the general structure we want to use when we're defining and adding new content to the page. Now, to be clear, a lot of this work, like changing the title or deleting the content, is things you want to do interactively. If you just want the page to initially have a different styling or a different title or something like that, don't do that in the JavaScript. Don't use JavaScript to try to assign those, like to make that changes, right? Don't try to retitle your page by selecting the heading and retitling it. Just go to the HTML and retitle the content. DOM manipulation is for stuff that's going to change in reaction to user input, right? When the user does something on the page, we want to change dynamically, interactively. Anything that's just a static content that you want to be different, just change the static content, just change the HTML. Okay, and that's the basics of how we're going to do DOM manipulation, right? How we change the contents on the page. In the next video, we'll actually go through how to do that in interactive structure.